Hey everyone, my name is Karis. Excited to be with you all. I have enjoyed watching some of your presentations and learning from you, and excited to get to share a little bit about what I have been researching in my research topic of revivals from the First Great Awakening in the North American colonies in the mid-18th century. There's a long intro sentence for you. So I decided to focus on the revival specifically in North American colonies because it's a pretty broad topic. Spanning a large portion of European and American history. But I was really interested specifically in comparing and contrasting the theological and societal results of revivals from the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. I feel like my research has mainly focused on the First Great Awakening, but still I'll talk a little bit about the difference between the First and Second Great Awakening and what that meant on Christian society as a whole. And so the period I was most interested in, the First Great Awakening in America, or in the 13 colonies, began in 1734 when a pastor named Jonathan Edwards, who we have read about, donning his periwig and his black robes, mounted the pulpit in a small village called Northampton in Massachusetts. And he faced a congregation that he feared had lost their fear and reverence for God. And he could see this in their personal lives, in society, in Christianity as a whole. Church membership was just on the decline. And actually, before Jonathan Edwards was even alive in 1662, or at least, I don't think he was alive then, leading ministers in the Massachusetts colonies had decided to start something called the Halfway Covenant to basically meet people where they were at, because there was just this lukewarm Christianity. People were not as interested in the conversion and personal experience with God that the original Puritan pilgrims had so emphasized. And so this halfway covenant basically meant that if you became a halfway member, you didn't have to have a personal conversion experience or any signs of a personal relationship with God. You just had to agree to the basic tenets of the faith, and you had to agree to live a somewhat non-scandalous life. And if you did those two things, then your children, when they grew up, if they had signs of a conversion experience, they could become full members, but with the exception that they couldn't have the Lord's Supper, which is very interesting to me. Eventually, however, this rule about the Lord's Supper began to slip because halfway members began to make up the entire congregation. And before you knew it, by the time Jonathan Edwards arrives on the scene, most of the church members were not full members. Which means a full member was someone who'd had a conversion experience, had this more personal relationship with God. They were halfway members. And so this is what Jonathan Edwards was challenging in 1734, was this just lukewarm cultural Christianity, this rational, what he believed was a growingly legalistic approach to religion. And he emphasized the personal need for conviction and conversion and transformation. He was we're missing out on what God has for us. And so unknowing to him, his sermon marked the birth of what in many respects is known as the most notable revival of religion that America has ever experienced, which we call the Great Awakening between the 1730s and 1750s. And this Great Awakening would eventually lead and morph into the Second Great Awakening that starts at the end of the 18th century and goes until the mid-19th century. And so in this book I was reading called Revival and Revivalism, the author Ian Murray talks about how the First Great Awakening is really marked by revivals that were popping up in churches and in places mainly where pastors and preachers had just been faithfully preaching the same message over and over, often not in a very emotive or charismatic way. And then the Spirit of God one day just fell like fire on these congregations, and people started responding to messages that had been preached for years before. And then he describes how revivalism, once we get into the Second Great Awakening, revivalism, it becomes less about these individual moments of God's fire pouring out, if you want to use that language, and more about this spirit of revivalism. How do we as followers of God bring about this conversion experience and emphasize people coming and having this experience and being transformed and renewed by God. So it kind of went from God's agency, this could happen randomly, wherever, to like, we need to have more charismatic, emotive preachers. We need to like create a space with music and sermons that draw this out of people, if that makes sense. So from God's agency alone to human agency, partnering with God. That's a big shift from the first Great Awakening to the second Great Awakening. And so when I started studying this, I guess I was really interested in the role of preachers, revivalist preachers and pastors, especially studying the difference between the revivalist preachers from the first Great Awakening and the second Great Awakening. I wanted to know what role the charisma and the emotion played, especially if the emotion wasn't as big of a part in the first Great Awakening. And so what I quickly discovered was there's really, even within just the first Great Awakening alone, there's no one type of revivalist preacher. There are preachers like Jonathan Edwards, who spoke quietly and calmly with theological rationale and brilliance. Then there were preachers like George Whitefield, who had been called America's first celebrity. He spoke with more theologically simply, but with incredible passion and power. An English actor and playwright who had actually like watched a lot of Whitefield's sermons during that time said that he could make an audience weep or tremble by his utterance of one word, "Oh." And so when I began my research, I think I expected more of the revivalist preachers to be, from the first Great Awakening, to be like Whitefield. But I found that more than not, many were less emotive and charismatic in the first Great Awakening, and more emotive and charismatic in the second Great Awakening. And during the first Great Awakening, the response to such preaching was not always what we might associate with revivals. Because I don't know about you, but when I would think of revivals, I would think of the classic, like, falling down, being slain in the spirit, falling down, shaking, weeping, and all of that stuff. And so while some people did experience this, of course, there were a lot of others. And in fact, this book marks many more occasions and events where people's experience of revivals was in silence, was just in the heaviness of their sin, of just like silently responding to that conviction. And the heaviness of their sin actually just brought them to absolute silence and not to weeping and crying out and yelling. And so I just was like, that's really interesting. And regardless of whether people were crying or falling down on their faces or not, what was consistent throughout every revival sermon and response was the very strong presence of conviction, of realizing the depth of people's sin, and then converting, like wanting this transformation experience where they repent and receive forgiveness. And then what I was really interested in was how this repentance actually led to changed societies, changed families, changed relationships, changed churches, changed politics, all of these things. And I was really, really fascinated to learn about the social justice implications that many of these revivals led to. For example, the main thrust of Christian abolitionism emerged from the evangelical revival of the 18th century that I've just been talking about, and because it was based on the beliefs of morality and sin, and people were convicted not just of personal sin within their families and marriages or communities, but convicted of the way they had viewed humanity in general, especially within slavery. This happened for George Whitefield. Apparently, he had started out as someone who was like advocating or arguing for slavery, and then was convicted himself and began to change his note as he started preaching in North America specifically. So yeah, I thought that was very interesting, that what marked a revival more than just this like high moment in a church or in a tent or wherever they were having these revivals was not just like the fanaticism, but the longevity that's not a great sentence, the fruits of the Spirit that would be seen in people's hearts and lives after the initial revival sermon was over. And so as I was researching, my interest became less and less about the preachers and their specific use of charisma and emotion, and more interested in just the results of the revivals, because it seems like there was all kinds of preachers, but what mattered most was the results. And I even read one specific account in this book because he documents all these firsthand accounts of revivals, which is really, really cool. And there was one man that Murray quotes in this book named Reverend George Baxter, and he describes Kentucky during the mid-18th century, a colony that was known to be rich in revivals. And so this Reverend George Baxter visits Kentucky, and he returns from his trip and says, "I found Kentucky the most moral place I'd ever been. A profane expression was hardly heard. A religious awe seemed to pervade the country." And there's just countless accounts like that of just like societies that were completely turned around because of revivals. And that, not just from a historical perspective, but theological perspective, that makes me really, really excited. And I want to see those kind of revivals in our churches and our lives today. So all this to say, there's still a lot more I need to research, but I'm specifically interested in comparing and contrasting the results theologically and just on society that the revivals of the First Great Awakening had versus the revivalism, the spirit of revivalism that the Second Great Awakening had. That led to this like altar call, soul-saving evangelicalism that we might be more familiar with today in modern America, versus the more significant, or I shouldn't say more significant, we're already seeing my bias, but just the more societal changes that the revivals from the First Great Awakening were causing in how people viewed slavery and how people viewed marriage and how people viewed community. There also is some questions about what it meant for Native Americans, because this revival, the spirit of revivalism and revivals in themselves were a huge unifying factor for the colonies. And so while there was a lot of good that was going on within the colonies themselves, did it come at the cost of a lot of Native Americans losing their lives, losing their lands, because the revivals led to unity, which then caused the colonies to expand and push out more, believing that they were coming in with the best way to live and the true form of religion, of Christianity. And so yeah, there's a lot to wrestle with there for me, because I see the beauty of these revivals and I'm so drawn to them and impacted and inspired, but I also see that they came at the cost of a lot of minority groups and like the Native Americans. So I'm already over time, so I'm going to put a pin in it, but I'm excited to continue comparing and contrasting the revivals of the First Great Awakening versus the revivalism of the Second Great Awakening, and looking how this theology of this is the work of God alone versus this is the work of God and man or humanity, how that differed in the results that we see on society, on Christianity, on communities, and look forward to writing this paper and continuing to learn from all of you. So thanks for watching.